The morning my daughter-in-law Nadine changed the lock on Henry's workshop, I was standing 10 feet away with his old key in my hand, and she knew it. She stood at the kitchen window, watching me try the handle. She didn't come outside. She didn't call through the glass. She just stood there with her coffee and watched me stand in the cold, as if waiting to see how long it would take me to understand. I understood immediately. I just didn't want to believe it yet. What she didn't know, what she had no way of knowing, was that Henry had left another way in. He had arranged it 15 years before she ever set foot on this property. That key, and the quiet reason behind it, would become the thing that undid everything she had planned. But before I tell you what I found through that door, please, if this story touches something in you, something you recognize from your own family, hit the like button and subscribe to Silent Tears Stories. Leave me a comment and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I always love knowing how far these stories travel. Henry Marsden, my husband of 41 years, had built that workshop with his own hands the summer before our son Peter was born. It had started as a shed, really, just a way to store his tools out of the garage. But Henry was never able to leave something at good enough when better was possible. By the following spring, it had insulated walls. By the year after, a wood stove, a workbench that ran the full length of the south wall, and windows he'd salvaged from a farmhouse demolition in Elora. They were mismatched. Too clear, one with a faint amber tint, and I teased him about it every time the afternoon light came through sideways and turned the whole room gold. It has character, he'd say. It has gaps, I'd say. Then it has ventilation. He could make me laugh even when I wanted to complain. That was the most Henry thing in the world. We had bought the property in Guelph in 1988, when the street still had gravel shoulders and the nearest coffee shop was 20 minutes away. I remember standing in the backyard that first October afternoon, looking at the leaning fence posts and the overgrown hedgerows, and thinking we had made a terrible mistake. Henry stood beside me, 3-year-old Peter asleep against his chest, and said simply, "We'll make something of it." For 35 years we did. We planted apple trees along the north fence. We built a proper porch. Henry expanded the workshop twice, adding a loft for storage and a small side door that opened onto the walkway running between our lot and the Pemberton property next door. Grace Pemberton, our neighbor for nearly 2 decades, used that walkway often to cut through to the park at the end of the street. Henry had given her a key to the side door years ago, back when her hip was bad, and the longer route around the block had become too much for her. She might need it in an emergency, he told me. She can knock, I said. He just smiled. Grace is too proud to knock. That was 15 years before Nadine locked me out. At the time, I had not understood why Henry was so insistent about it. Later, I would understand everything. Henry died 3 winters ago after a short illness that moved faster than any of us were prepared for. He was 71. He had seemed fine at Christmas, building a step stool for our granddaughter Sophie in the workshop, her initials carved into the underside where only she would find them, and by March he was gone. The silence that followed was the kind that fills a house from the inside. I moved through the rooms looking for things to do, and found that Henry had already done most of them. The porch railing he'd been meaning to replace, the drip in the kitchen tap, the crooked door on the linen closet that had never quite closed properly. All of it quietly fixed in his last months, as if he'd spent those final weeks making sure I wouldn't need to ask for help. At the time, I thought he was being practical. Later, I understood he was being something more than that. Peter began coming by more often after the funeral. He and Nadine lived in a rental in Kitchener, 40 minutes down the highway. But I noticed Peter seemed uneasy when he visited, pausing in doorways, looking out the back windows toward the workshop, asking quiet questions I didn't quite know how to answer. One evening in the autumn after Henry passed, Peter sat across from me at the kitchen table and said the property was too much for one person. I told him I was managing fine. He said he knew, but that he and Nadine were paying rent on a place they'd outgrown, and that Sophie was 8 now and needed more space, and that the house had 3 bedrooms and more yard than I could realistically maintain. Nadine sat beside him and reached across the table and took my hand. "This is your home," she said softly. "We would never make you feel otherwise." I said yes. Of course I said yes. I was 69 years old, and eating dinner alone at a table built for 4, and my daughter-in-law was holding my hand and promising that nothing would change except that there would be more life in the house again. They moved in the following spring. I took the basement suite, which Henry and I had finished years before. Its own entrance, a small kitchen, a sitting room with a window that looked out at the apple trees. It was more than enough. For a while, it felt like a good decision. The changes came slowly enough that I could almost convince myself I was imagining them. Nadine rearranged the main floor. That was reasonable. She lived there now. But Henry's things began to disappear, his books from the hallway shelf. The framed photographs from our trip to Cape Breton. A wooden clock he had made himself which had hung above the fireplace for 20 years. I found most of them in boxes in the storage room, not thrown away, just put away. The distinctions felt important to Nadine. To me, it felt like erasure with better manners. I started spending more time in the workshop. It was where Henry was still most present. His tools hung on the same hooks in the same order. The workbench held the same coffee ring stain from the same mug. Sophie came with me sometimes after school, sitting on the tall stool by the amber window, talking about her day while I oiled the handplanes and kept them from rusting. Those afternoons were the quietest good thing I had left. Then one morning, I walked out and found a man I did not recognize taking photographs of the workshop. He stood near the east wall with a tablet, angling the device to capture the roofline, then the foundation. He wore a pressed shirt and a lanyard, with a company logo I couldn't read from where I stood. "Excuse me," I said. He turned, startled. "What are you doing here?" I asked. He said something about a property assessment. Before he could say more, Nadine's voice came from behind me. "He's from the insurance company," she said pleasantly. "Just updating the coverage file. Nothing to worry about." I smiled and said, "Of course." But I had seen his tablet. The form on the screen was not an insurance form. It had a header I recognized from the community planning meetings Henry used to attend. Preliminary site assessment. That evening, I called the city. I asked whether any development applications had been submitted for my address in recent months. There was a brief pause while the person typed. Then, yes, a preliminary inquiry had been received regarding a proposed severance and residential development on the rear portion of the lot. Rear portion of the lot, Henry's workshop. I drove to the county land registry office the next morning and requested every document on file for the property. I sat at a table in the records room and went through the folder page by page. The deed was unchanged. My name, and after Henry's passing, my name alone. But further in, there was a letter of intent, filed 4 months ago, expressing a buyer's interest in purchasing the rear 120 feet of the property. At the bottom, where it said the current owner had expressed preliminary interest in discussing the matter, there was a signature. It looked like mine, the letters curved in familiar ways. It was not mine. I took photographs of every page. Then I went to my car and sat very still until my hands stopped shaking. Our granddaughter Sophie came to my suite that afternoon, the way she often did after school. She was 11 now, old enough to feel the tension in a house, young enough to still be honest about it. She twisted her hands in her lap, the way she'd done since she was small. "Grandma," she said, "I heard something. I wasn't trying to." "Tell me," I said. "Mom was on the phone last night. She said the workshop has to come down before anyone will take the offer seriously." Sophie looked up. "And she said Dad will sign whatever she puts in front of him." The room felt very quiet. "She also said," Sophie continued, her voice dropping, "that once the property is split, you can't stop it." I covered her hands with mine. "You did the right thing telling me. You always do." She didn't look reassured. She looked frightened, and I understood why. She wasn't choosing between me and a stranger. She was choosing between her grandmother and her mother, and no child should ever have to do that. 2 days later, I found a glossy brochure tucked under my door. A senior residence in the east end of the city. Beautiful photographs. Private suites, full care services. At the bottom, a handwritten note in Nadine's writing. We should talk about what's best going forward. I folded it carefully and set it on the table. She wasn't just trying to take the property. She was trying to move me away from it, piece by piece. First by making me feel like a guest, then by making me feel like a burden, and finally by offering me a comfortable solution somewhere else entirely, far from the truth. That was when I stopped waiting and started moving. I did not go through the main workshop door. The new lock Nadine had installed made that impossible. I walked around the side of the house, through the narrow strip between the fence and the old hydrangea bed, and knocked on Grace Pemberton's door. Grace answered before I'd finished knocking. She was 78, a retired schoolteacher who had brought me a casserole every week for 2 months after Henry died, without once asking what I needed. "I think I know why you're here," she said. "The key," I said. She nodded and disappeared inside. When she came back, she held a small envelope. Inside was a brass key, and beneath it a folded note in Henry's handwriting. 6 words, "For Rosalind, when she needs it." I stood on Grace's step and read those 6 words 3 times. He had known. Not exactly what would happen, but that something might. And he had prepared for it the way he prepared for everything. Quietly, without fuss, without telling me, because he had known I would worry. The side door of the workshop opened without resistance. The lock turned as smoothly as if it had been used yesterday. I stepped inside. The smell reached me first. Sawdust, linseed oil, the particular stillness of a space that has been carefully tended. I stood there for a moment just breathing. Then I went to the cabinet. Henry had built it himself from red oak, tall and narrow, mounted to the wall behind the workbench. He had always said it held tool warranty papers and equipment receipts. I had never had reason to open it. The cabinet key was hanging on the back of the workshop door, on a hook, on a ring, with a tag that had my name written on it in his handwriting. Inside the cabinet were documents I had never seen. A copy of the property deed with a handwritten annotation, witnessed and notarized, stating clearly, the workshop structure and the land beneath it could not be severed, sold, or demolished without my written consent, and this restriction survived any future transfer of the main residential property. It was dated 8 months before Henry died. Beneath it was a letter, to me. I sat down on his workbench stool. He had written, "I don't know if this is worry or intuition. Probably both. What I know is that the workshop is where I've been most myself, and I want it to be there for you the same way. If it ever comes to something, if someone ever tries to take it, the documents are here. And Janet Foss at Foss & Kellerman in town has the originals. She knows what to do. Don't be quiet, Rosalind. You were never made for quiet." He had signed it with his full name, the way he signed birthday cards, when he was being formal and a little funny about it. I held the letter for a long time. Then I photographed everything, locked the cabinet, locked the side door, and walked back to Grace's house. "Well," she said. "He was ahead of us the whole time," I said. She smiled. Henry always was. Peter came home from a work trip 2 days later. Nadine had arranged what she called a quiet dinner. But when I came upstairs, 2 men I didn't know were seated at the table, and a set of documents was laid out in front of the empty chair that was clearly meant for Peter. I looked at Nadine. She looked at me. Something crossed her face, half a second, before the smile returned. "Rosalind," she said carefully, "the timing is actually fine since you're here. We were just—" "I know what you were doing," I said. I placed Henry's folder on the table in front of Peter's chair. The annotated deed. The letter of intent from the land registry, with a signature that was not mine. Peter came in from the hallway, still in his coat, and stopped. "Your wife has been arranging to sever the rear portion of this property," I said, "without my knowledge and without my consent. That signature on the letter of intent, that is not my signature." The room went completely still. Peter opened the folder. He looked at the first page. He looked at the signature. He looked at Nadine. She said, "Peter, this isn't—" "Let him read it," I said quietly. He read every page. The older man at the table began collecting his papers. The younger one had already stood up. Peter looked at the deed annotation. "Dad's restriction clause." He set it down. "Did you know about this?" Nadine said nothing. Janet Foss at Foss and Kellerman holds the original, I said. She's been holding it since Henry passed. The older man said, very evenly, that they would need to pause proceedings. He and his colleague were at the door within minutes. After they left, the three of us sat in the kitchen. Sophie had come downstairs and stood in the doorway. I didn't send her away. She had earned the right to see how it ended. The truth came out in pieces, the way it does when someone finally stops managing and just speaks. Nadine and Peter had debt, real debt, a failed business investment, credit lines Peter had not known about. An outside buyer had offered a way through if the property deal went forward. She had believed she was protecting them. She had believed she was fixing something before it could hurt her family. You could have asked, I said. She looked at me, really looked, the way she hadn't in a long time. You would have said no. Maybe, I said, but you never gave me the chance to say yes. That was the truest thing either of us said that evening. There is no clean resolution I can offer you here, because real life rarely provides one. Peter and Nadine had a long, difficult road ahead of them. The debt was real. What she had done was real. Some things take years to repair, and some things may never fully close. But the workshop is still standing. Sophie and I spent a Saturday afternoon in there, not long after, oiling the hand planes, the same as always. She found the step stool her grandfather had made for her, initials carved into the underside, and set it up by the workbench so she could reach the high shelf. She ran her fingers over the carving and didn't say a word, and I didn't either, because sometimes the most important things are the ones that don't need to be said at all. That is what Henry had understood, long before any of this began. He did not leave me a way back in to make a point. He left it because he knew me. He knew I would need a place that was still ours. And he knew, better than I did for most of my life, that silence is only peaceful when you choose it. When it is chosen for you, when it is imposed by people who have mistaken your patience for permission, silence costs you everything. I will not pay that cost again. So if you are watching this, and you recognize something in this story, if there is someone in your own life who has been slowly rewriting where you belong, I want you to hear this clearly. Your name is still on that deed. Your history does not disappear because someone refuses to see it. And more often than you know, the people who loved you most have already made sure there is another way in. You just have to be willing to use it.